and she will be talking to us about her work developing ontologies in the finance and manufacturing domain. Okay, go ahead, Elisa.
Can you see my screen?
We can, and we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm going to speed through some of the motherhood and apple pie stuff. Some of you are familiar with my work, which spans both the EDM Council, which is an enterprise data management and analytics space, and the work that I do at the OMG, where I am on the board of directors, also on the architecture board, which just approved SysML version 2 for advancement to a PTC vote, which some of you may have seen. So that's a really important role that I play, especially from a JPL perspective. And most importantly, I am an ontologist. And so the EDM Council, if you're not familiar, is a pretty large organization, bigger in terms of members than OMG, less standards focused, but has provided a lot of frameworks and other things over the years that people use pretty widely for data management and data governance and cloud data management and that kind of thing. Other areas where the council excels include research and benchmarking, a lot of industry benchmarks, especially in data, regulatory engagement, a lot of the regulators, especially in finance, but also in other organizations now, are participating and are looking to us for guidance in data governance, data management. So we do training, certification, outreach, a lot of networking. And the area that I participate in is involved in driving standards. We have a collaborative ontology development environment that I'll touch briefly on. We support several industry standard ontologies, and so on. So the lab, which is the area that my work falls under, is really very focused on open source, publicly available industry ontologies. We have a collaborative development environment that we use for continuous integration and deployment, which has features that you're all familiar with from software engineering, including GitHub, a wiki for note-taking and related documentation, and Jira for issue tracking and management. All of it integrated, and a number of what I will describe as test suites, depending on the project, that exercise the ontology to make sure that when any change is made, it is backwards compatible with everything else that we've done, and that it meets all of our criteria for quality management. So the preconditions that I think are important for you all to understand are that we really need everybody to work together to accomplish any sort of common goal, especially related to standards. And that means shared understanding of objectives, which I thought would be easy for people to grok. It turns out that people aren't always on the same page, even with the objectives for a standard. And so that makes my life interesting. But setting up priorities, some incremental objectives for ontology development so you're not boiling the ocean, policies that everybody agrees on for development purposes, and most importantly, the work actually needs to be sponsored by stakeholder organizations, or people don't pay attention and the work doesn't get done. So for industrial ontology development, what I mean is cross-organizational. So not just a single company or organization, but ontologies that a group of organizations choose to use in an industry or choose to sponsor in an industry to address specific goals and requirements. And so you need a team that has both the knowledgeable subject matter experts and ontologists that can help guide other folks, and people that can help with designing queries, mapping the data, testing documentation on the back end, and then project oversight, as you might imagine, to keep things on track. Many of the use cases that we support are related to compliance and regulatory reporting, because that's an area where a lot of organizations do not mind sharing data and coming to a common understanding to reduce the regulatory load on all of them. And then other kinds of use cases include cross-organizational data sharing or interoperability, typically for research applications. So standardization on top of that means an additional level of rigor that you might not need for an enterprise or application level ontology, but you might need if you're throwing spacecraft up into the wild that depend on those ontologies. And so that requires even more of a mandate from your stakeholders. And people really need the time in order to do the work. And arguing over the nuances of some technical term is not for the faint of heart. So just saying. So there are a couple of use cases I want to talk about today. The primary one, which covers manufacturing, but started out in identifying and being able to manage substances around the world that go into developing medicinal products. Lots and lots of use cases hang off of that, whether they are for cross-border prescriptions, you're on a trip, JPL sponsored, to send you off somewhere to meet with people from the European Medicines Agency, and you ran out of your blood pressure medication, or you're stuck somewhere and need some other medication. You want to know that it's the same thing that you received at home rather than something entirely different. And there are lots of other things like ensuring that we can monitor shortages, such as for baby formula during COVID, enable smart manufacturing, and all of those kinds of things. So there's a set of ISO standards. There are 5 of them for identifying substances, medicinal products, and the pharmaceutical products and dose forms related to those medicinal products. Those ISO standards, however, are inconsistent. The definitions for the same term across the 5 ISO standards were developed by a single task force at the ISO level are in conflict. And the pharma companies were trying to implement this stuff and had no way of reconciling the terminology or in really highlighting the places where the standards were inconsistent. And so Bayer and a number of other folks decided that they needed an ontology to help them reconcile the semantics across these standards so that they could all deliver the documentation required either for ongoing clinical trials or for medicinal product development, for marketing authorization, for manufacturing authorization, all of those things, which go not only to the FDA in the US and to the European Medicines Agency in the EU, but to all EU member countries, which might change the language or some aspect of the notation that the EU approved, or anywhere else on the planet for that matter, some 200 odd jurisdictions, each of which mandates one or more different natural language processes, natural languages in which your pharma drugs have to be labeled. So the amount of work for developing the packaging and the labeling for the drugs that you buy at CVS or Rite Aid or wherever is extraordinary and is more expensive than manufacturing the darn drug. And a lot of people don't actually realize that. So this particular project started in 2021. We built out a minimal viable sort of proof of concept in 2022. We were able to achieve 1.0 level implementation, leading to the ontology being placed in production by a number of pharma companies at the end of 2023. Last year, we built out more use cases and have been advocating for industry adoption. We did proof of concepts at the European Medicines Agency, at the World Health Organization, and for FDA last year as well. And so now we're moving forward with new use cases that investigate what it means to bridge gaps between batch tracking and other manufacturing processes across the life cycle for what they call PQCMC, chemistry manufacturing controls, and other regulatory processes. So much cleaner flow of the data through their manufacturing tools, which often include SAP among others, and there are regulatory reporting systems. One of them is called RIM. Not sure what that stands for, but you get the idea. And so over the course of the first year and a half, we had a handful of use cases that we addressed, and we did not attempt to address them across the ISO standard by implementing their primary ISO standard, which is the one for medicinal products, section by section. Rather, we implemented the ontology use case by use case, touching whichever standard was important in order to represent that use case, but without going any further than we needed to answer the competency questions that were defined in the use case. So the most basic one was identifying substances and the roles that they play in various drugs, just getting a model to cover things like the active moiety of a particular drug substance as opposed to its full makeup as a salt or a solvent or something else, getting the right ingredient strength represented, which is different for every one of the 200 odd jurisdictions that we have to cover, and how these chemicals are grouped, etc. We moved from there into linking that into the regulatory and manufacturing space, also covering therapeutic indications and clinical trials. And then we've been working more recently on things like jurisdiction agnostic products, falsified medicines, pharmacovigilance, and this link between clinical and regulatory, and this year moving back into the regulatory and manufacturing integration space. So and I believe, even though I gave you a PowerPoint, some of the use cases that the pharma companies have been working on internally are represented in this one slide. And I'm not going to go into all of them in depth, but you can see this one from Bayer, where they're trying to align a number of their systems, whether it's for substance representation or for manufacturing or for reporting out of the manufacturing environment, and then back into the European Medicines Agency, which is where the SPOR control vocabularies come in at the bottom. This is what we were able to achieve over the course of the first year and a half, and answering questions like, where was this particular substance used across our manufacturing facilities, and in what drugs might it appear, is no joke. Bayer had a product on the market that they suddenly, after years, heard that there was a patient who had a severe complication from taking that particular drug, and the postmortem found a toxin in that patient's system that they believed came from the drug. And Bayer went back and said, we don't use that anywhere in the world in manufacturing the drug. It took them 60 days to figure out that it was actually used by one manufacturing facility somewhere on the planet to replace another substance in the packaging, and it leached into the drug. And that's what this particular patient ill. And so they had to pull all of those products off the market. But I mean, 60 days is a long time to wait to pull stuff off the market. So bottom line is, now, using the ontology, they can answer that question in seconds. And there are a number of others listed here from some of our participants. This one from, I think it was GSK, was able to bridge their regulatory to manufacturing space for vaccines. Johnson & Johnson is building an entire portfolio, sort of repository to map the substances and to all of the various registration systems they have internally, especially across the organizations they've acquired over the years. And there are others from Merck. This is Novartis. Here you have Roche. I mean, there are a number of them here you can look at that are all different applications for the same ontology, which is really very cool. So here are some of the partners we've been working with to map the ontology to their substances. We've done so with FDA, European Medicines Agency, World Health, as I mentioned. There are a couple of others in progress, including the fire messages from HL7, and on and on. Related to maybe more closely to the work that you all do are some of the ontologies we've been working on in finance. There have been a lot of issues since the meltdown in 2008, which caused the European Banking Commission to mandate the use of certain kinds of governance principles, which today the banks still have not really done all that well. And so now the banking regulators are escalating their intervention and requiring people to give them money, and they're fining them in a big way for not meeting the requirements. So what I want to say about that is the development of all these things includes multiple simultaneously evolving subdomains, which you all have. And a lot of it reflects a highly distributed team worldwide collaborating around the clock, which you all sometimes have. And continuous integration and publication to maintain synchronicity, also important for digital twin. So as a consequence, your development methodology has to be more rigorous. It does require more automation, and you have to have very clearly defined policies and collaborative procedures, much clearer than for a particular corporate or application specific ontology in order to be successful. So what we found on FIBO was that if we could do all of those things, we could actually link the data despite silos across organizations and banks. And one thing to say here is that a lot of the banks we work with have over 6,000 databases. So now you're talking about leveraging data, especially the largest banks that came together through mergers and acquisitions across all of those systems, and being able to answer questions about it, including things like data privacy, which we all care about. Really much more flexible schemas, very rich multi-level taxonomies and controlled vocabularies, and using a pattern-based architecture so that we can leverage the work to enable machine learning and use of LLMs and things like that, if possible. And what we've found is if you use some of the patterns that we developed for FIBO and are now using on IDMP, you get much higher accuracy and provenance for question answering, which I think is a critical point here. So
really quick, do you have a second? Just a quick broad question. What do you see are some of the biggest, let's say, top 2 challenges to reaching that goal? I think the last 2 slides that you were showing some of the challenges from the banking industry, I think it was.
Yeah. So
I'm an
one
aerospace
is
person, so I think that was good. Yeah. Go ahead. That's my
they're
question.
actually the same as your challenges. Getting people to change what they are comfortable doing is hard. Getting people who have managed databases for years and whose jobs depend on those databases to continue running, even if they are duplicative, which is not always easy to tell, is hard. They don't want to give that up. They don't want to lose their positions, which they think they would do if those databases are no longer needed because the data is redundant, et cetera, et cetera. So it's often the human factor that's the hardest thing. And getting people to agree on the same definition is not for the faint of heart.
I agree. Thank you.
So one other project that you may be familiar with, and if you're not, you should go look for it, is the Industrial Ontologies Foundry. I have a link to their homepage at the bottom of the slide. This is an effort between NIST and OAGI to develop a set of ontologies for manufacturing. Some of the work, especially in supply chain, is starting to really take hold. And although a lot of the work they've done so far is somewhat academic without the sort of back-end data to map to the way that we've done for 5.0 and for IDMPO, still, I think it's really, really worth paying attention to, and you all might want to have somebody on your team weigh in and talk about where it helps you and where it does not. And so I have some of the, that one looks duplicated. Okay. Some of the things you need to do early on is set up some policies for your naming conventions, metadata annotations, common patterns, what kind of automated quality assurance you want to establish in order to ensure that your ontologies that are across subdomains all work together. And like anything else, processes for release management and versioning. People forget when they're doing ontology work that it's actually an engineering exercise. I don't get that, but you guys know where I come from. So the thing that I would mention is that 5.0 was developed in a pretty ad hoc way. And over the years, since I took over, which is in about 2019, we've started implementing more and more patterns, standardizing those at OMG in the Commons Ontology library, and then backfilling 5.0 with them. And people are really recognizing them and are using them. So another question, Magid. Is your hand up?
Yes, just a reminder, 1 more minute.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so here are some observations from what we did. IDMPO, the 1.2 publicly available ontology, has about 600 classes in it, over 350 relationships, and so on. Roughly 25% of the classes are actually from those patterns from the OMG Commons library, and more than 40% of the relationships and attributes, and you have the links here. And then our pharma users, our pharma users actually recognize those patterns now, and they've mapped them to their internal data. And so some of the patterns, especially for the controlled vocabulary representation, is at this link, and that's open, and you guys can look at it. And I know there's lots of controlled vocabularies in airspace, so hopefully that pattern will be useful to you. And using those patterns gives you the building blocks to do machine learning and natural language processing, custom models, and all of that with your using ontologies. This is the way you would do any sort of an engineering model. So that's mainly what I wanted to say. A lot of people have asked about using top-level ontologies. Here is what I would say about that. Understand your use case before you pick one, because a lot of people that we know have been burned by hidden or not obvious constraints lower down in the food chain and some upper ontologies that have, at the end of the day, caused issues and logical inconsistencies. This is some of the things that we've run into or mentioned here. And hopefully those will be useful to all of you. This is just our environment for testing, which I spoke about last year. Some links to supporting tooling that we provide at the EDM Council, and how we do these things. And there you go. So if you have any questions, Magid knows how to find me.
Thank you, Elisa. I just have one question about the upper ontologies. I was wondering if there is some study comparing the known upper ontologies in the literature and giving practitioners guidelines on how to go about choosing the best one for their use case.
There are studies comparing upper ontologies. Some of them are written from the perspective of the person who built one of the upper ontologies they are comparing. So you have to take those with a grain of salt, because of course everybody wants to promote their own. I think the bottom line is, although there are a few PhD theses out there and a couple of other studies I've seen, you really need to understand the use case before you can say whether or not something is relevant to you. And often that's further in the weeds. We are mandated for a couple of the projects I work on to use or map to BFO, and found some challenges with doing that for things that are specifications for other things, because a specification for a substance can play the role of an ingredient. When you're talking about the documentation and the labeling and everything else, you have an ingredient in a product at some percentage with some molecular weight or other dose form information and things like that. And it's the specification playing the role in a recipe, which is also a specification, not the real thing on the shelf and in the real world. And that's where you run into issues. We're working with Barry Smith and with John Beverly and some of the guys to try to address that, because there are so many healthcare ontologies that use BFO that we have to at least be compatible or be able to map to them. So we have a small mapping, if anybody's interested, from the Commons Library to BFO. I can do the same for UFO or for some of the other things that people use most commonly. It takes work to create those mappings, though, so I try not to do them very often. Because some of those upper ontologies change slowly, it makes that more feasible.
Thank you, Elisa.
Yep, you're very welcome.
Okay, everyone, we will be taking a 10 minutes break. We will resume in, like